This lecture is about notating extended chords. In other words, naming them so that we can refer to them verbally or in writing. Extended chords are created by adding additional thirds to normal seventh chords. And so in the case like this, if we start with a D minor seventh and we add the next third up, in this case E, then we would call that a ninth because the interval between the bass note and the added third would be a ninth. The next third up would be the 11th. The next third up would be the 13th. Once we've done that, you may notice that we've used all 7 pitches in the diatonic scale. So if we add another third above the B, then we're just back to where we started with a D, only we're 2 octaves higher. Finding the names of these chords can present a challenge because there's a lot of possibilities and a lot of potential for confusion. And what we're going to do is look at 2 different methods. The first one deriving from our common practice music theory and the other from pop and jazz music theory. The methods are actually quite different, but each have their strengths and weaknesses, as you will see. In the common practice method, the chord is described first by naming its triad, its basic triad. And so we start with the 4 basic triad types: major, minor, diminished, and augmented. And then we simply describe each interval that isn't in the triad by its interval type and size. So for example, in this chord here, we have a basic minor triad. The distance between the root and the 7th in this case is a minor 7th. So we use a small m to indicate the minor 7th. And then we look at the next interval, which would be the 9th. And so that goes from D to E natural, which is a major 9th. So in this case, we use a capital M for the 9th. And then we look at the interval of 11th. D to G is a perfect 11th. And so that's the next one. Lastly, we go from the D to the B natural, which is a major 13th. And there you have it, a D minor minor major perfect major 13th. Now, admittedly, this is a pretty cumbersome label. It's less cumbersome when we're talking about 7th chords and 9th chords, but when you actually get to fully fledged 13th chords, it's pretty intimidating. However, it is very precise. It tells us exactly what intervals are in it. In other words, we could actually figure out what the chord is based on the name of the chord. We would know every single note in it. Let's try to figure out this one. So the basic triad, B flat, D, F sharp, would be a B flat augmented chord. So we would start with B flat and then a plus sign for the augmented triad. In this case, the 7th is a major 7th, B flat to A. So we would use a capital M to represent the 7. The major 9th is the next interval, which is B flat to C. So we would have a capital M for the major 9th. And then the next interval would be B flat to E, which is a kind of 11th. In this case, B flat to E flat is a perfect 11th. So B flat to E natural would be an augmented 11th. So we would have an A representing the 11th, A for augmented. And then finally, we would have a B flat to G flat, which is a minor 13th. And so our chord symbol then would be B flat plus, that's the augmented, major, major, augmented, minor 13th. And again, if I told you the name of this chord and I said, well, what are the notes in it? You could just name them out. You could figure out exactly what chord this was just from the chord symbol alone. Now, there are some exceptional cases in the common practice period. These 2 are exceptional because they already have names. We don't need to use this other method to name them because they are already named something else. In this case, this is a half diminished chord, and this is a fully diminished chord. These two chords, by the way, don't tend to get extensions. We don't usually get a fully diminished ninth chord or a fully diminished 11th chord or a half diminished 13th chord. Those chords just don't show up, except in rare circumstances. Now, the other exception involves this possibility here, which is when we have a major chord, but which has an altered fifth, a lowered fifth. When we alter the fifth by raising it, we call it an augmented chord, but we don't have a name for this one. And so the procedure that we use is to use the first M to represent the major third, because we do still have a major third. And then we can figure out the seventh, in which case is a minor seventh. And then we have to show in the chord symbol that we have altered the fifth. So this would be how you would represent this chord: D major minor 7 with a flat fifth. Fortunately, since this is the only exception, this is the only one you have to really memorize. So there's capital M representing the major third and the altered fifth shown in the chord symbol. In popular music and jazz, the names of the extended chords are based on only 3 scales: the Ionian, the mixolydian, and the dorian. The Ionian representing the 1 chord and its extensions, the mixolydian representing the 5 chord and its extensions, and the dorian representing the 2 chord and its extensions. Any chords that don't neatly fit into one of these scales are written by finding the closest match and then indicating which alterations have been made. And there's only one exception in this naming scheme, which is called the fully diminished chord, which is also, you will recall, an exception in the classical music method. In popular music and jazz, the fully diminished chord is just referred to as a diminished chord or diminished 7th chord, and it's spelled exactly the same way and used exactly the same way it would be in common practice music. All right, so let's look at first the chords that are made from the Dorian scale. So here we have a Dorian scale starting on D, and then we have the chord extensions that can be made from that: D minor 7, D minor 9, D minor 11, D minor 13. In other words, the basic triad is minor flavored, and then we derive these possible extensions. Now you'll notice that this chord symbol is much simpler than what it was in the classical music method. That's because we assume the intervals that exist in the Dorian scale. So we can write the minor 13th chord as simply D minor 13th, because that assumes that we have a minor 7th, major 9th, perfect 11th, major 13th. The minor 7th chord then would be the root 3rd, 5th, and 7th of this scale. Now, when we actually notate the chord in music or a piece of sheet music or in a paper or something that we're writing, there are several different ways of doing that. I'll indicate several of them right here. These are all equivalent. And I would say that the most preferred method is probably the one on the far left, and then they get less preferred as you go towards the right. They're all, you will see them all in various types of music. Now, if we use any alterations, then we have to describe them in the chord symbol itself. So let's take a look at this first one here. It's basically the same notes as a D minor 7th chord, D, F, A, C, but the 5th has been altered by being lowered. So we would say it's a D minor 7th with a flat 5th. Let's look at the second one here. So we look at this D, F, A, which would be the notes of a minor chord, and then an E, which would be the acceptable 9th, but the 7th is a C sharp. So what we do is we call this a D minor with a 9th to show that it's a 9th chord, and then we indicate what's been altered by showing that in the chord symbol itself, in this case sharp 7. This last one has several alterations. So if we compare it to the normal notes of the D minor ninth chord, in other words the notes from D dorian, we have D, F, those are in the scale. A flat is a flatted 5th. C sharp is a raised 7th. E and G are both the natural notes in the Dorian scale, and then B flat would be the flatted 13th. So in order to write this chord, we would show that it's a flat 13th and a sharp 7 and a flat 5 of a basic D minor chord. Now this chord is something I just made up. I've never actually seen this chord being used in anything. If you played it on the piano, you'd realize why. Note that this first chord, which in jazz is called a D minor 7 flat 5, is the same thing as what we would call a half diminished chord in classical music, common practice music. All right, here are the chords derived from the mixolydian scale. So on the left we have a D mixolydian scale, and then the possible derivations of that: D7, D9, D11, D13th. Now in this case, the basic flavor of the triad is a major triad, and then we have the minor 7th, major 9th, perfect 11th, and major 13th. All of these chords are called dominant chords, and this kind of derives from the fact that even if they're not used as the dominant, in other words, the 5 chord of a key, they're still called dominant chords for that reason. And notice that these are way simpler than what you would use to write them in the classical music method. However, they do presuppose that you know that they are from the mixolydian scale, so that you already know what interval types you'll be dealing with here. The 7th chord then would be the root 3rd, 5th, and 7th of mixolydian scale. And we can write it in several ways. I've seen it these two ways. There aren't so many ways of writing this one, just a D7 chord, but you do have to remember that when you see in popular music D7, what it means is D major minor 7 or D dominant 7. And again, if you have chords which are basically a D major minor 7, but have alterations of one or more intervals, then you have to indicate which notes those are and how they're altered. So in the first example, we would have a D, F sharp, and C. Those are all normal notes, the root 3rd and 7th of a D mixolydian scale. But the 5th has been altered, so we would write this as a D7 with a flat 5. Next one, D, F sharp, A, C are all notes of a D dominant 7th chord, the D mixolydian scale. But the E has been raised, so in this case we have a raised 9th. So we would indicate this chord as a D dominant 7, in other words D7 with a sharp 9, just like so. And lastly, we've got this crazy chord. So we've got D, F sharp, A sharp, so we have a raised 5th, C is normal. We have a flat 9, and then we have a sharp 11 and a normal 13. So we would say that this is a D 13th with a sharp 11, a flat 9, and a sharp 5. The alterations are written from the large numbers in order down to the small numbers. You know, it's just sort of easier to read that way. Most of the time you don't get chords that have quite so many alterations. Or you're just told to make some alterations, and you can make whichever ones you want. All right, finally let's look at the Ionian scale. So in this case, the major scale would project these extensions: D major 7, D major 9, D major 11, D major 13. So these are the intervals that you would see: major 7th, major 9th, perfect 11th, and major 13th. Another way of putting this is that the major 7th chord in popular music and jazz is made from the root 3rd, 5th, and 7th of an Ionian scale, starting with the same root. And again, you'll see this written in a number of different ways. This is probably the most common. You'll also see it spelled out like this. This one is particularly clear because there's less confusion possible between the large M and the small m when you're writing it down. Sometimes I've seen this. Sometimes you see it with a little triangle. And these are all perfectly legitimate and reasonably clear once you know what they are. But again, I think that the one on the left is probably used a little more often. Again, any notes that are not in the scale must be indicated as altered intervals. So in the first one here, the D, F sharp, and C sharp are all pitches from the D Ionian scale, but the A sharp is not. So the A sharp has to be indicated as a sharp 5. D major 7, sharp 5. The next one, we have the notes essentially of a D major 9th chord, D, F sharp, A, C sharp, E, but the A has been altered to a flat 5, so that's how we would write this. Very last one here, D major 7, flat 13, sharp 11 would be this chord here. This is a fairly tense chord if you play it on the piano. To identify a chord, the easiest way to get started is to identify the third. So if we look at the third, if it's a minor third, then it has to be based on the Dorian scale. That's the only one that has a minor third in it. If it's a major third, then it could be either the Ionian or the mixolydian. So in this case here, E, G, B, D, F sharp, the third E to G is a minor third, so this has to be some kind of minor 7th chord. And in this case, if we write out the Dorian scale, then we realize that all of the notes that are in this chord are from this scale, and so we know that this is just a regular E minor 9th chord. If the chord has a major third, then we have to look at the 7th as well. Because if the 7th is a major 7th, we know that it's based on the Ionian scale. If it's a minor 7th, then we know it's based on the mixolydian scale. And then we should be able to figure out all the rest. So in this case, it's a major third and a major 7th, so we know that's Ionian. So if we write out the Ionian scale, starting on the same root, of course, then we can look and see if there are any notes that are not in the scale. In this case, the C sharp is not. Therefore, we have an altered 5th. So this chord then would be an F major 9th with a sharp 5th. In this chord, the third is a major third, but the 7th is a minor 7th. So that means it's based on the mixolydian scale. So if we write out the mixolydian scale, then we can compare. In this case, the C is in the scale, the E is in the scale, the B flat is in the scale, but then the G flat and the D sharp are not. So those are altered. So the G natural is the one that's in the scale, so the G flat will be a flat interval. In this case, it's the 5th. And then the D is normally D natural. In this case, it's D sharp, so the D would be the 9th. Therefore, this would be a sharp 9th. And so we would write this chord as a C7, C dominant 7th, C mixolydian bass chord with a sharp 9 and a flat 5th. Now here's some exceptions. Suspended chords and added note chords. So these are two types of chords that we do find in popular music, but which don't fit the normal rules that we're talking about. So in this case, if we have a chord in which there is no third, but that third has been replaced by a 4th, these are called suspended chords. So you can look at this grouping right here. So the first one, D, G, A, C, is, the G has replaced the F. Now, I'm going to call this a D minor 7 suspended chord. And the reason is because I know that I replaced an F natural to make this chord. Now, you wouldn't know that. And you can see that when we look at this second one, that the actual chord we're looking at is identical, but it all depends on which third I replaced as to whether I call it in one or the other. In this last instance, we have a major 7th, and so that can only be a major 7th chord, but then we've replaced the third with a 4th. So we get a D major 7th suspended. Again, the minor 7th and the 7th suspended chords look and sound exactly the same. However, they do imply that they came from a different scale. And as you understand more about improvisation, it starts to make a difference as to what notes you would use in your improvisation over each of those chords. Added note chords are chords in which you have a basic triad to which you add another note, but that isn't the 7th scale degree. Because if we add the 7th scale degree, it just makes it into a 7th. But in this case, like on the first example, I added a 2. I added the 2nd scale degree. So this would be a D minor with an add 2. And typically when you do this, you have the notes that you have to add are the 2nd, 4th, or 6th scale degrees for the same reason. If we add the 1st, 3rd, or 5th, then we've just doubled one of the notes in the chord. If we add the 7th, it becomes a 7th chord. We have names for those. But if we add the 2, 4, or 6, and there isn't a 7th in the chord, then we use this added note type. Also, there is some distinction that can sometimes be made between whether we add a note that's a 2nd or 9th. Like in other words, the 2nd chord in our list here, I call an add 9 chord because the note I added is actually a major 9th above the bass, not a major 2nd. This is a dicey thing because who knows what sort of voicing you're going to use in the chord, or there may be a 9th and a 2nd in the chord voicing. So essentially these two, add 2 or add 9, are identical. Here would be an add 4th, and here would be an add 6. So in other words, it's simple to name them. You figure out what is the basic triad, and then you add whatever the note is that you're adding. Again, though, keep in mind that the note that you're adding must be from the appropriate scale. So if we're adding a note to a minor chord, then we add a note from the mixolydian, from the Dorian scale. And then if we're adding a note from the to a major chord, then it would be from the Ionian or the mixolydian. Keeping in mind, of course, that except for the 7th, both the Ionian and the mixolydian have the same exact note structure. All right, so what do you do with these? One thing to do is to experiment with the piano, at the piano with the extensions of chords, and try this with scales other than the Ionian, mixolydian, and Dorian. And I think that this will kind of help you to figure out, well, why did they pick these 3 scales as the main scales to base all the chords on? So in other words, we can ask ourselves, why isn't the Aeolian scale the one that we base all the minor 7th chord types on? And when you do the chord extensions in the Aeolian, you'll probably figure out why that is. Question number 2 here is, might there be a better scale than the Ionian scale to base the major 7th chords on? And you can see if you can find that. And then another thing might be to look at what sorts of chords and extensions you get when you use more exotic type scales. So in this case, I recommended using octatonic or whole tone or hexatonic, but you could just as easily use any of the scales that we've looked at in class so far.